Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Just one thing to note as it relates to this episode, where I discussed the Sefer Kviya Kesef and the works of Rabbi Yosef Ibn Kaspi. That book that was discussed on this episode is now available on Sefaria. So I did want to mention that for those interested in the book. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Torah Auctions. Their upcoming auction is this coming Tuesday, June 4th at 1 p.m. To peruse the catalog, register, and bid on items, go to bidspirit.com or see the link in the show's notes below. Some of the many interesting items in the auction include, they have a large selection of classics, including a first edition Mordechai, a first edition Mizrahi, Leo Mizrahi on commentary on Rashi, a Sefer HaAruch, Shalosh Teshuvos Rashba, Shalosh Teshuvos Maram Rothenberg, and much more. Interestingly, they have two lots of the Kesef Mishnah, Chelik Gimel and Daled, so the third part and the fourth part. The third part printed in 1574 during the lifetime of Rabbi Yosef Karo, as it says on the title page, but that's the third part. But the fourth part was printed in 1576 after he died, as you see on the title page. So those are, I think, lots 24 and 25 in the auction. There's also, interestingly, a full set, 3 volumes of the Shulchan Aruch by Gur Aryeh Finzi of Italy. It was printed in Mantua, 1721 to 23. This is a really unique, you can look and see this in the auction catalog. The first volume, which is not very common, has a very interesting title page, which has pictures, and it says they all look different. And it says their name. One is Rashi, Rambam, Maril, Marik, the Ramah, and the author himself. So you can see kind of like it's like a woodcut, and you can see what how they depicted them differently. I don't know how they decided how to depict each one, but they did. There's also a full set of Zhetomer Shas, the Ribnitzer Siddur, the Satmar Rav title by his whole Shas. And there's many more interesting items. There's many more classics. There's a lot of Zhetomer, Slavita, Chassidus Farm, and many, many more things. So check them out, Torah Auctions. Again, the auction is Tuesday, June 4th at 1 p.m., and I'll put up a link in the show's notes where you can check it out. To sponsor an episode, to support the podcast, or to advertise on the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp group, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or see the links and information in the show's notes below. Also, please subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, the chat, where it's an admin-only chat, where I post new books, Svarim, and other things. There's a link in the show's notes, as well as the Svarim Chatter YouTube, Svarim Chatter Substack. You can also find those links in the show's notes below. Also, please rate and review the podcast, wherever it is that you listen to podcasts, or the 24/6, Apple, Spotify, etc., and enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Basil Herring, who is the editor of the RCA Siddur, which we had a previous episode about, and he was the executive vice president of the RCA for a number of years and has held a number of other positions. This episode we'll be discussing his book that he published a few decades ago, which is his dissertation, which is entitled Joseph Ibn Kaspi's Kviya Kesef, a study of medieval Jewish philosophic Bible commentary, which is about Rabbi Yosef Ibn Kaspi, and who was a Rishon at the time from Provence, South France, and we'll be discussing him and his works and everything related to that. So thank you, Rabbi Herring, for joining me once again.
Thank you, Nachi, for having me on again.
So let's start out with Ibn Kaspi. So as I mentioned, this was your dissertation that you did, like you said, a while ago. But why, how did you get involved with Ibn Kaspi, and why did you decide to, I should mention this is a book, there's a large introduction, and then there's also, you included the Hebrew Kviya Kesef, which is on Chumash, and then you have a full translation. So before we get into this exact dissertation book, how did you get interested in Ibn Kaspi at all?
So I worked at Bernard Revel Graduate School of Yeshiva University on master's and then a doctorate. And anyone who ever studied the Rambam, especially the Moreh Nevuchim, would come across the name Ibn Kaspi. He wrote several commentaries, which we can talk about, and on the Moreh Nevuchim. And he was always known to be a creative, one might say controversial, Rishon who feared no one. He considered himself a Talmid Muvak of the Rambam, although he lived many years after the Rambam. At one point, he even traveled to Egypt to visit the grandchildren of the Rambam in the hope that he would gather philosophical insights into the Rambam's writings. But of course, that was very difficult in that in that time. He lived from 1280 to 1279, some say, until about 1340, which makes him essentially a 14th century Provençal, which is southern France, author. And we can talk a little bit about Provence at that time because that is a significant part of his biography. The Rambam himself wrote in a famous letter to the leadership of Lunel in Provence that his great expectation and hope was that the Provençal communities would truly become central to the future of the Jewish community and the study of Torah and philosophy in generations to come. So Provence, in and of itself, is a very interesting place, which, of course, we can talk about.
Yeah, so perhaps we should talk about a little bit about Provence. First of all, we'll throw out another name. Someone in Provence at the time, Ralbag, was someone that lived there, was in that area, was a contemporary of Ibn Caspi's. So what was Provence? There were a number of others living in there and in Provence at the time. So what was Provence like at the time of Ibn Caspi's life?
So you need to understand that the main events in Provence and Spain were the Maimonidean controversies. There were two Maimonidean controversies. The one of more particular significance for the subject at hand was the second one, which came about in about 1305, when a number of Spanish authorities, including the Rajba in particular, condemned the study of philosophy and were very critical of the Rambam's works in philosophy. They believed that he was too influenced by Aristotelianism and the Islamic students of Aristotle, in particular Avicenna and Al-Farabi. And as a result of that, there was actually the various haramim that were put out against the study of philosophy and against studying the philosophical works of the Rambam, the Nesher Hagadol. Although they couldn't attack his halachic works, they certainly attacked his philosophical works, and in particular the Moreh Nevuchim. So as a result of that controversy, and there were all kinds of haramim going back and forth, you had a major effort on the part of the scholars in Provence to defend the Rambam and to, in fact, utilize his perspectives on Tanakh in writing commentaries. So, for instance, you have the Radak, Reb David Kimchi. Radak preceded Ibn Caspi, but he was certainly Maimonidean in outlook and in methodology. At the same time, the other major influence at that point in terms of philosophy was Ibn Ezra. Now, Ibn Ezra is an interesting individual in his own right. Of course, he wrote what he wrote became part of the Mikrot Gedolot, and not just one commentary, but several. But he too had certain very, we should say, controversial doctrines. But history was kind to him. And even though that was the case, he somehow remained very legitimate in a way that Ibn Caspi perhaps was not, at least for several centuries. So the whole atmosphere in Provence in the late 13th, early 14th century was filled with effervescence, to use the term that Isidor Twersky of Harvard used, in which there was all kinds of creative efforts to bring together the works of the classical commentaries on Tanakh, in particular Rashi, who was certainly accepted and not considered controversial in any way, but at the same time to introduce philosophical themes. The main, for our purposes of this discussion, the main controversy related to allegory. Now, what is allegory? If you've ever studied English literature, there are certain works, for example, Jonathan Swift, the Gulliver's Travels, where allegory involves reading a text on multiple levels. There's a surface level, and then there is a deeper esoteric or hidden level. And the philosophic tradition said, yes, on the one hand, there's pshat, on the other hand, there is a much deeper al derech hasod. And this became one of the key issues of contention in the 14th century. There were those who went all the way as far as denying that there were actually historical people called Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that they were just ideas or metaphors for certain philosophical ideas. Ibn Kasbi rejected that type of an approach, and he was very much of a Pashtan. He believed very strongly in Pshat, but at the same time, there was, again, following his teacher, the Rambam, he believed that there was a much deeper level which the masses could not access, but which in his writings he wanted to bring to the fore.
Right. Okay. So, and you know, as we already mentioned, and we were talking about before we started recording, the Ralbag is someone like this, similar, and Ralbag was accepted. Right. He's printed in every Nachman Koresh Gadol. It's not in the Chumash, but that's very available. And even though he was also very much a rationalist, Aristotelian Rambam kind of figure. But just before we get more into that, we should, and also another, we didn't mention the Ibn Tibbins, were also in Provence. There was the whole Ibn Tibbin family. But just to finish up on Ibn Kasbi's biography, do we know who he studied under, and if you have any students? And also another thing about him, you mentioned Egypt, but he traveled extensively. Something else we probably should mention here as well.
Yeah, we don't know who his teachers were. It's very difficult to reconstruct his history. By the way, his name, Ibn Kasbi, is a translation of the town in which we believe he was born, which is Argentière. Argent is silver. And that's for that reason he named all of his books, all of his writings have the word Kesef in them. This is why Gevia Kesef, Matzrefle Kesef, Tamar Kesef, you name it. So he liked to play on his name in that fashion, which, by the way, is very interesting because one of the psukim that the Rambam quotes very much in the Moreh Nevuchim is a pasuk in Mishlei, which talks about kesef and zahav, specifically tapuchei zahav bebaskiot kesef. The pasuk that says there are apples of gold in filigrees of silver, meaning you have to approach Tanakh as in that way, meaning the Torah is teaching you gold, but the gold is covered over by a silver patina, if you will. And not just is it a silver patina, but there are, if you know what maskiot are, it's a filigree. So the filigree has holes in it, and you have to be able to look through the holes to see the gold that's hidden underneath. So the Rambam develops this idea of, yes, the silver is there and the silver is valuable, the silver is beautiful, the silver is truth. However, underneath the silver, for those who know how to uncover and discover it, there is gold. So in Kasbi's case, and this is why I mention it, this plays into Kasbi as a man of silver, meaning, I believe, that he very much wanted to stay on and to maintain the pshat, the outer level. He never, unlike, for example, Ralbag and others, he never left the pshat level, and all of his commentaries, in a way, try to balance pshat and sod. The pshat meaning for the masses, because the masses are unable to penetrate through to the gold below, and the sod for those yechidim, for those individuals who have the tools. And we can talk about what those tools are to be able to penetrate to the real underlying philosophical truths that are there.
And one more thing to follow up with about is his travels, his extensive travels, and where he traveled.
So he traveled mostly in Spain. He talks about having children in Spain who he visited. And interestingly enough, just like the Rambam, who had the problem that you couldn't really talk about hidden Maaseh Merkava, i.e. metaphysics in their terms, to the masses. So what was he doing writing a book which anyone could read and have access to? So the Rambam, if you know familiar with the introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim, he writes the Moreh Nevuchim actually not for the public, but to a particular Talmud of his. So this way he gets around that problem. So many times, Ibn Kasbi does the same thing. he writes his books and he addresses his children. He's writing it for them, and this is not a mass publication for everyone else. So he travels to Spain a lot. He goes to Egypt, as mentioned. It would appear that he was also in Italy. By the way, Ibn Ezra, for those who know Ibn Ezra, he was also he talks about Sardinia and what he saw there. And this is very important for Ibn Kasbi in terms of his commentaries, because he not only travels to these places, but he uses those travels and what he sees and experiences there, and he integrates them in terms of understanding things that are in Tanakh that he believes he otherwise wouldn't be able to know. You know, when he was in Egypt, he saw that the people were wearing square headdresses like a kafia. He says, no, now we understand why it's arba kanfos. The Torah was talking dibra Torah kilashon yaram. We'll talk about that a little more, but the Torah references and the context, and it utilizes what are the customary behaviors and realia, things of a given place and time. So these travels of his are reflected in many ways and in many points of his writings.
Okay, so an interesting thing is that something we should mention here already is that about his writings. You talked about how he wrote this book, Sfarim for the Masses. One reason maybe why he's more of an obscure figure is his opinion and his denigration of the masses and his comments of the masses. If you want to tell the listeners a little bit about that.
Sure. He is very, should I say, dismissive of the ignoramuses, not just those, and he refers not just those who are clearly uneducated, but even those who consider themselves educated, but who he calls them little foxes, who distort what the Torah is telling us, and who think that they understand these hidden secrets in the Torah that require a lot of preparation and discernment and careful analysis. So he very often will just say, the masses won't understand what I'm talking about. I don't care. In fact, one of the 19th century scholars think that Ibn Kasbi was the first one to write different works for different audiences. So therefore, for example, on the Moreh Nevuchim, he wrote two commentaries. One is a surface commentary, or its surface commentary. And the other one was the one which was probably most responsible for his being considered, I wouldn't use the word heretic, but certainly extreme. And that is the hidden doctrines of the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, in which he believes, as do many 21st century scholars, that there is a deeper meaning to what the Rambam was writing, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the surface meaning that would be apparent at first view. So, the work that I did on the Gevia Kesef would be addressed to the elite, so to speak, as opposed to the ignorant masses.
Right, which would mean the Matzah for Kesef is the one to the masses, the Pshat and Chumash, and the Gevia Kesef, which we'll discuss a little more. What you did is the more, like I said, esoteric commentary. So perhaps we should mention a little bit of a brief overview of his writings before we get in more specifics. You mentioned everything has the name Kesef. I don't know, is there 37? I don't know how many writings. He has many, many writings. A lot of them, I think, are still in manuscript, but they're not all printed. But if you want to just give an overview, I know in your book, you do just, briefly discuss it. If you want to briefly mention, again, not all of them, people can see the book, but if you want to talk a little bit about some of them.
So there are different categories of what he wrote. For instance, he wrote 9 works on Tanakh, on different books of Tanakh, basically modeling himself on Rashi and Ibn Ezra. And some were on Ezra Nehemiah, some were on Mishlei, some were on Shir HaShirim. And all of them have these names: Chatzotzrot Kesef, Mizamerot Kesef, Kapot Kesef. Now again, not all of these are still extant. Many of them still are in manuscript form. But about 9 volumes of his writings were published in the late 19th century by a fellow by the name of Last, L-A-S-T, and that remains the bulk of his published work. Now, besides that, there are independent philosophical works that he wrote. For example, Shulchan Kesef, that picks up different philosophical issues, which he talks about the legitimacy of prophecy, what is the mechanism of prophecy, and so on. Then he has one on Maaseh Bereshit, which is the opening chapters of Bereshit. Interestingly, Gvia Kesef takes over from Mizrachei Kesef, because Mizrachei Kesef just deals with his opening prakim, and Gvia Kesef continues on from there. Then there's a sefer called Menurat Kesef, which is the Maaseh Merkava, which is for the medievals called metaphysics. Then he has another work called Ka'arat Kesef, which talks about Schar V'Onesh, and his own analysis and views thereof. And then he talks about the possibility of tshuva and how does this affect the God's knowing the future, and so forth. The third group of his writings, he actually wrote several svarim on grammar and Hebrew lexicography, meaning the rules of grammar that you have to have in order to be able to understand Tanakh, and the various words and logical constructs which are used in Tanakh in his view. The two commentaries, the next group of the two commentaries on the guide, the one that deals more with the Pshat is the Amudei Kesef, and then the one that goes into the esoterics of the guide, the controversial work of Kaspi, is known as Maskiot Kesef, as we mentioned before, the filigrees of silver that you have to look through in order to get to the gold that lies below. And then he wrote a number of super commentaries on others. He wrote a commentary on Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah. He wrote a summary of Aristotle's Ethics and Plato's Republic, and so forth. Then there were various other works, Sefer HaMusar, which was published, interestingly, maybe 60, 80 years ago, and in English by Abrams, which is essentially an ethical will in which he leaves instructions for his sons and his family for them to follow in the course of their life. He talks there about what would be a good course of study as children go through different stages of their lives. The last work that he wrote was known as the Tam HaKesef. It's a very interesting work. It actually consists of 8 droshes. Shlomo Pines, who was, of course, a very famous historian of Jewish thought at Hebrew University, actually wrote a whole article in which he analyzes why Kaspi is so interesting and significant, because there's a drosha in there that talks about the likelihood of a reconstitution of a Jewish state and a return to Zion, in which he sees a precursor, he meaning Pines, sees a precursor to modern Zionism. The other major theme that we need to talk about is his relationship to the Christian world. Provence was at that time Christian, not Muslim. And he lived through various periods or cases, especially when he was in Spain, where there were all kinds of Jewish-Christian polemics. And throughout his writings, he's concerned to disprove Christian theological positions, and especially when he finds the Christians trying to read that into or out of Tanakh. And he is unabashed and forthright. For example, at one point he says, they accuse us of crucifying their Messiah. He says, we did it. I don't have to apologize for it. As a matter of fact, he deserved it. And if we had the opportunity, we would do it again, because he was such a kofar and so on and so forth. And he doesn't hesitate to attack Christian theology, the Christian leadership, their the Galachim, and so on and so forth. And that comes through in many different ways, even here in the Gvir Kesef, but throughout his writings too.
And what's interesting about that is also he's from Provence, which is a Christian part of South France. The Avignon is there. The Pope was there, right? There was the Pope in Avignon. So he lived, that was literally his backyard. He was living by the church.
Exactly. Interestingly enough, Pines also believes that he was actually influenced in a certain very subtle ways by certain Christian schools of thought, the Pelagians and so on, when it came to his doctrines regarding God's foreknowledge and contingencies, whether God's knowing everything that the future will bring, how does this square with Bechira Chovshit and so on, and he uses their arguments and their logic in terms of creating his own overall view. As far as Isidore Tversky is concerned, and I think this really gets to the gut of it, what is fascinating about Ibn Kasbi is that in him we find a synthesis of so many streams of thought, Jewish as well as non-Jewish, ancient Greece, Aristotle, Plato. He also has other sources amongst the early Aristotelian commentators. Also, because the Rambam was so heavily influenced by Al-Farabi and Avicenna, so Ibn Kasbi knew them as well. He studied their works too. And we see a number of his doctrines and positions that he takes reflect those sources too. And then, of course, in him we see a strong influence of the tradition of philosophical commentary on the Torah, as I mentioned, whether it's Radak, Ibn Ezra, and others who with whom he had obviously knew their works, and he includes that.
So you mentioned there about his Bechira, his take on that. I mean, obviously, mainly you focused on his Tanakh commentary, and that's something we'll focus a little bit more on shortly. But if you do want to mention his extreme rationalism, as you mentioned, his opinions on Bechira, I don't know if there's something you want to, some examples of how extreme, quote unquote, he was.
He absolutely affirms that man has freedom. The problem, of course, for all these philosophers is if God knows everything about the future, then how do we square that circle? He develops this whole theory of the contingent, in which God's knowledge of the future does not determine what it is that man will choose to do. He in particular, plays this out with regard to Paro and the Egyptian experience, where everything is foretold, and yet Paro is punished for doing what he's doing and for his affliction and punishment and whatever they call it, genocide of Bnei Israel. So he's very clear that man always retains that ability to. He's not determined. He's not. His bechira is never taken away from him, and he's always responsible for his actions. Okay.
Okay. So you mentioned, obviously, a number of times you've mentioned the Rambam, and that's his hero, like you said, his Rebbe. Even though he never learned under him, he considered him as. So, I mean, how does his relationship with Rambam come out, besides for writing commentaries in Moreh Nevuchim, if you want to talk a little bit more about those, but how do we see that in his Tanakh commentary and all his writings?
Right. So, we mentioned in passing before, the Gemara talks in Yevamos and in Bava Metzia, uses the expression, Dibra Torah ki lashon bnei Adam. The Torah invokes or utilizes colloquial or common language and ideas in putting forth the words of the Torah and ideas of the Torah. He gets this from the Rambam. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim and elsewhere says that essentially, in order to understand the Torah, we don't have to. Well, I'll put it this way: when the Gemara talks about Dibra Torah kol lashon bnei Adam, it's really talking in a halachic sense, that you can't be so medaktek on every word in the perek, in the pasuk, because certain words are just put in over there in order to smooth things out. And the Rambam says that there are two kinds of parables in the Torah, two kinds of mishalim in the Torah, two kinds of passages in the Torah. One in which there are certain things which are very, very precise. Every word teaches you something. Every letter is there for a reason. And you have to try and dig in and understand every single thing. On the other hand, says the Rambam, there are many passages in the Torah where you just have a general story which is given to you in order, and you can't really be medaktek, you can't be very precise in understanding every single word and finding a particular meaning in a particular word. So Ibn Kaspi picks up on this, and therefore he says that Dibra Torah Lashon Bnei Adam, and again, this is also found in Ibn Ezra, that we cannot always find a very, very significant meaning in every single word. This is very controversial. You have someone like the late Professor Nachama Leibowitz, who is very critical of him and others as well, for not being a particularly noteworthy or reliable parshan on Tanakh and on Chumash. And she says that he's a radical in this respect. What comes out, however, and in the book, identify a number of places, both in the Gvir Kesef and elsewhere, where he doesn't say that. He says you have to be careful. There are some places where you have just a general mashal, you have just a general description, and you can't be medakdek. On the other hand, there are many places which have great philosophical importance. And in this instance, he, for example, will do very careful analysis of the four visions of Avraham Avinu, in which every single word is to be understood as teaching certain very carefully delineated ideas and positions. So here we see the direct influence of Rambam and Ibn Ezra, and he takes it to an extreme. He does. And he's not afraid to say, well, this is just thrown over there, but you can't really see any particular significance to this word or this phrase. It's just there in order to round out the story. Having said that, he is very much of a pashtan, in my view. He doesn't depart from the simple pshat, and he wants to maintain the pshat wherever he can. I'll give you an example, and here he actually disagrees with the Rambam. He's not afraid of disagreeing with the Rambam. The Rambam famously, in a number of places, says that wherever you have a vision described in the Torah, this didn't actually happen in the physical sense of an event. What it is it happened it was a mental representation in the mind of the Navi, whether it's Avraham, in different cases. For example, Yaakov by the Sulam, the dream, not just the dream was a dream or was a vision, but even the events that followed. For example, by Sodom, when they go to Lot, or for example, when Sarah is told, overhears that there's going to be a baby that will be born a year from now. So Ibn Kaspi says this whole thing took place in a dream. This whole thing did not, Rambam says the whole thing took place in a dream. So Ibn Kaspi says sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. Sometimes a Navi will actually have a vision or have a dream, but then at some point he will wake up and he will implement it in a way which happened in reality, if you will, in the external world, not just happening in his mind. So here we see that he will actually be so bold as to disagree with Rambam and go his own way. Another very interesting way in which he relates to Rambam is regarding what I refer to as a psychological theory of miracles. There's a major controversy regarding whether the Rambam believed in miracles. In other words, the suspension of nature. On the one hand, the Rambam is Aristotelian in that he says in the Perush HaMishnayos, in the Hagdama and so forth, that everything was set Ben Hashmashos on the Erev Shabbos of the first of creation. And therefore, even the things that would appear to us to be miracles were in fact built into nature from ab initio, from the very beginning. And then comes the question, well, did the Rambam always hold to that? Because as we know, the Perush HaMishnah was written when he was very young, 23 years of age. Did he stick with that for the rest of his life? And there are those who would argue that no, as he got older, he actually changed his position. And they point to many passages in the Rambam in which he says, yeah, there were in fact miracles, a suspension of nature. And God interceded, if you will, to do that. Ibn Kasbi, as much as he was radical in his outlook and Aristotelian in his overall worldview, very strongly interpreted the Rambam and himself adopted the view that while we don't like to multiply miracles, nonetheless, there are certain places where absolutely miracles did occur, where there was a suspension of nature. The most famous instance would be Shemesh B'Givon Dom in Yeshua, where people like the Rambam and others said, absolutely, there's no way that the sun could stop in its tracks. There's no way that God, even for Yeshua, would have done such a thing. That's completely unacceptable. That goes against everything that we believe. Nonetheless, Kaspi says it happened. That's exactly what did happen. And not only that, but I understand the Rambam to be affirming that as well. So we see here a very carefully balanced or nuanced approach to these philosophical doctrines. And he was not afraid to disagree and to take these positions. He wasn't scared of anyone who came before him. And as he says very often, Ha'emet yored darko, the truth will have its way. Or sometimes he will say, Ha'emet eid latzmo, the truth is its own witness. And you can rely on your intellect in order to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And this is the mark of a truly educated individual, as opposed to the masses. Now, this brings me, I'm sorry if I'm carrying on here a little bit, this brings me to his psychological theory over here. He says many times the Torah will describe events as if they were miraculous, that in fact they are not miraculous at all. And they will describe things which, if you truly understand what is happening, you will understand that this is a very natural phenomenon. Famous case of this is the case of Bilam. And he asks the question, who cares whether Bilam cursed or blessed Bnei Israel? We who are sophisticated philosophers know that we don't believe in magic. We don't believe in sorcery. The Torah doesn't believe in sorcery. So why was God so concerned that Bilam should not curse, but in fact should bless Bnei Israel? So here he says, because the answer is, and he goes into this at some length in the Gvir Kesef, he says that if people are affected by what they believe, and if someone believes that a man who is powerful curses me, that will affect me. And he says the physicians know this to be the case. If I think that I'm cursed, then this will affect not just my mind, but my body. And he said, and in fact, this is what Balak says to Bilam. Balak says, everyone knows that whoever you curse is cursed and whoever you bless is blessed. So therefore, had Bilam been permitted to curse the people, and they would have known that they had been cursed by this great Navi who was famous and so on, the plague would have broken out. There would have been an absolute catastrophe. And as a result of this, the people could have been chas v'chalila destroyed. So he therefore says, this is why God wouldn't allow him to curse Bnei Israel. He extends this even to the point of saying any bracha. any bracha that is given, whether it's from Yitzchak to Yaakov, from Avram to Yitzchak, even the Kohanim, in the Birchas Kohanim, he says this is very important that people should feel that they are blessed and not cursed. And because of that, if they would otherwise to think that, you could have those terrible kinds of consequences.
Okay, just to draw, you mentioned the Ralbag there, especially about the son by Yeshua. The Ralbag says, the Barbanel takes a big issue with Ralbag on that, and the Ralbag actually, there's a very interesting Ralbag though. He says it didn't happen, but if you want to believe that it did, great. You believe Hashem is great. It's actually very interesting Ralbag to see. Another thing, Ralbag, another parallel you mentioned with the dreams. Ralbag even says by I don't know what the Ben Kaspi says by Yaakov Avinu with the Malach of Esav's Sar Shel Esav with the fight, and then he was limping. He says it was all in a dream. It never happened. He says the Ralbag goes that far as well. So there are.
Kaspi says the same. Kaspi says the same. He will say the whole thing was in a dream, and what? So God could make him limp. He limped. Enachinami, he limped. He actually connects it, and this is another thing, by the way. I don't know if there are any women who are listening to this podcast, but he's very critical of ignorant women, women who are ignorant, and he says the word nasher, right, Yid HaNasher, he links this to women. He says because Yaakov always had trouble with women in his life, and this was related to this particular dream as well. He was very weak. He was weakened by the women, and he refers specifically to Dinah, the Maisa Dinah, and he refers to Devorah, and he refers to Leah and Rachel. The women are fighting. So this is the way in which he will take words. We didn't really talk about this, but the etymology of words to him is very important, and he can trace the roots of these words, such as Nasher to Nashim or Isha, and say that this is what this is referring to in a philosophical sense.
So the Gviya Kesef, something which is what you worked on and you published in here with the Hebrew text, with the translation. I mean, it's not a massive sefer; it's on Alter. So why did you pick the Gviya Kesef and talk a little bit specifically about the Gviya Kesef?
So, in a sense, I have to give credit to my teacher. At the time, it was a very highly regarded professor, Arthur Hyman. He had studied under Wolfson at Harvard back in the day, and he had been a professor of Jewish philosophy at Yeshiva University and then in the graduate school. And it was actually his idea to study, to pick up on the Gviya Kesef. Gviya Kesef had not been published before. To my mind, it's not been published since. I always said whatever I have to say about it is secondary. People are not interested in what Herring has to say. People are interested in what Kaspi has to say. So you might as well publish the manuscript in that form. I was very fortunate to have been able to locate the manuscript, which was at the University of Parma in Italy. And of course, the Hebrew University has a Machon L'Kitve Yad. And they had at that time been able to secure photocopies of the microfiche, actually, of the manuscript. There were other manuscripts at that time, this we're going back now to the 70s, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, the Ginsburg collection in St. Petersburg. I tried to get copies of that. I was not successful, or at least a copy of that manuscript. To this day, I don't know if it's actually ever been released. Certainly the Hebrew University at the time did not have it. There's also a Munich manuscript, a very partial manuscript that just has the first few chapters of what is found in the Parma edition. So having located this manuscript, I then set about, of course, transcribing it. Not an easy job because the manuscript itself was very old, probably 15th century. And of course, you had to be able to decipher a lot of that script. And for the most part, it was intact. There were certain passages there that where it was, where the manuscript had been, should I say, inaccurate, or there were words that were missing. But for the most part, it was in pretty good shape. What is interesting about the Gviya Kesef is that it contains a lot of commentary, philosophical commentary on Sefer Bereshit, because Caspi believed that most of the secrets of the Torah are to be found in Bereshit. He was of the view, which was quite widespread at the time amongst the Rishonim, that the reason why you have all of the stories, the anecdotes, the historical record, if you will, in Bereshit, was that these contained all of the secrets of the Torah that form the basis of all of the so-called halachic material in the Torah that starts out with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem in Beshalach. So in Bo. So in that respect, the Gevia Kesef is fascinating because it, on the one hand, maintains the pshat wherever it can, but it unabashedly attempts to implement his whole program of Tapuchei Zahav Maskiot Kesef, in which he will bring about both levels, on the allegorical level, esoteric level, as well as the exoteric, or the exterior, simplified, if you will, literal meaning. And there is much over here which anticipates what subsequent scholarship has gone about doing. And as I say, for this reason, many of the 19th and 20th century leading scholars made a point of studying it as well. I mentioned Twersky before. He was fascinated, and in fact, he taught I believe he taught a course or two at Harvard in the graduate school on Ibn Caspi. So he's a fascinating person in and of himself, both as one who reflects what was going on in the 14th century in the rationalist circles in Provence and in Spain. And at the same time, he had some very novel ideas, which he tied into his commentaries on Tanakh and on the Rambam.
Right, and so you publish a translation of it also, besides for the transcription of the manuscript. You have any examples of Gevia Kesef offhand, or
examples? Well, he spends a lot of energy in the manuscript, in the book, on the Akedah. He's bothered, for instance, by the whole question of if there was a tzivui to do the Akedah, can God change his mind? The philosophical issue. How does God change his mind in such a direct and profound way? And he provides various answers to the question, most particularly to say that he didn't change his mind. The tzivui was ha'alehu sham le'olah, not to sacrifice him, but to put him up on the altar. And as a result, once he had put him up on the altar, God could then say, okay, you've now fulfilled what I told you to do. Now step down and bring him down, and so on. But his main thrust in his commentary on the Akedah is where he goes to great lengths to show that, or to argue that the whole point of the Akedah, the main point of the Akedah, was to avoid human sacrifice. And he brings in many examples, not many, but numerous examples found in Tanakh and elsewhere of human sacrifice. And of course, this is something which he feels the masses misunderstand, as in the Kedarkam B'Kodesh, and they need to be disabused of this notion that God really wants human sacrifice, and that the main point of the Akedah was to teach us that even animal sacrifice was not something which God wanted. In the meantime, Abraham goes and sacrifices the ayil, Achar, Nechaz Basvach. So he says God never commanded him to sacrifice the ayil either. This was not something which God wanted him to do, but he felt at that point that he needed to do something. And so Abraham then sacrifices the ayil. But in point of fact, and here he's certainly following in the footsteps of the Rambam, sacrifice is not the first order, is not the primary goal of the service of God, and at the same, and instead it's really prayer, which is what we put on the highest level, and therefore in this, of course, he's very loyal to the Rambam, even though the Rambam writes in Hilchos Malachim that at the end of time, when the Mashiach will come, there will be korbanos, and the Beis Hamikdash will be there. But nonetheless, that will not take away from the idea that korbanos is secondary to tefillah and to meditation and to the rational impulse to serve God in that way.
So Gvir Kesef is part of what you referred to before as esoteric commentary, right? Matzef Kesef is the more standard pshat-based commentary in Chumash, and this is more of the other one, although you translated and made it available for the masses.
Yeah, et chata'ai ani maskir hayom.
So there's the translation here, and there's a 120-page introduction or so, and then there's the translation, and then you have the Hebrew text index and the Hebrew text in the back, so it's a few hundred pages. So one other thing mainly that we should just tie up with is that what were the opinion of his peers, the people in that generation, and then following generations of him? I know we mentioned some in his generation. Also forgot another one of these contemporary of his. I think it was Levi Aschein, right? Levi ben Avram, another real rationalist, was also a contemporary of his. But so what were the opinion of his, I guess, peers, contemporaries, and right afterwards, and then throughout the generations, those who knew of his writings, which were manuscripts? What were their opinions of him?
Right. So history was not kind to Ibn Kasbi. Barbanel, for one, was scathingly critical of him. I think unjustly so. He accused him of taking certain positions which I don't think Ibn Kasbi actually took. Nonetheless, he dismissed, he was, for one, dismissed Kasbi's writings as just being very Aristotelian and going against the mainstream view of what the Rambam really meant and taught. And I think that was the problem. The problem was that he pulled no punches. He thought that Rambam believed that the universe was eternal, and that by studying logic one learns that God is the cause of the world. Doesn't mean that God preceded the world, but that God is the essential cause of the world, that the world coexisted with God from eternity. He said that. He put that out there, not to the masses, of course, but he wrote it and he put it out. And so I think that because he was prepared to, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead kind of author, he was not judged kindly whether by his contemporaries or by those who followed him. Even from the very beginning of his career, he was attacked. For example, there was a certain Paitan by the name of Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, who even from the very beginning of his career was very critical of Ibn Kasbi, and said that he can't teach the masses things like this. This is not something which should be put in writing altogether. And as a result of which, Ibn Kasbi was burnt, if you will. He was hurt, and he decided that he couldn't be appreciated by those who were not philosophically astute or sensitive. This being the case, for hundreds of years afterwards, his works were simply not studied and not written, not rewritten and propagated, but remained in manuscript form.
Yeah, and you said some have been published, some not. Gvir Kesef is published here. I know Matzef Kesef, Rabbanit Dr. Abigail Rak, Zachron Levracha, worked on Bereshis. I had her husband on, and I think that's available. alatorah.org has, I think, her commentary on Bereshis that is available online somewhere, but I don't think the rest is finished. So a lot of it just is, like you said, not available. So if someone, it could be, maybe Keter Chumash has something I'm not remembering from Bar Ilan if it has, but what would you say to someone interested in learning a little bit about Ibn Kasbi, learning some of Ibn Kasbi? I mean, what would it be recommended for anyone to pick up any of his works, and what will they find there? What will they gain from opening some of Ibn Kasbi's works?
Well, there's no question that it's not easy to find the works as published. If you go to Amazon.com, they're asking you, crazy numbers for these things. There may be certain booksellers who have copies that you would be able to get a hold of. I don't know that there's that much otherwise online other than what you mentioned. if there's anyone here listening to this who'd like a copy of the volume, I do have a few copies that I'd be very happy to share gratis with anyone. They should just write an email to you, Nachi, and we can figure something out. As I say, I do have some copies of the volume which I did have published.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if shipping, but yeah, they can reach out to me, email me. You have, so like I said, as we're recording this, I don't know if this will be released. As we're recording this, Amazon has one copy for $1,675.75. Don't buy that. Don't do that. There are probably other, elsewhere, but it's like I said, it's been a few decades, the book. So that's around. So actually see here, there's Hebrew edition. There must be old print of Sefer Mishnah Kesef Volume 1, Volume 2. Those are like $6.99, $7.99. Those must be reprints that you can buy on Amazon. But there's not a lot available for those interested. So your book, like I said, that we discussed, was published by Kitav many years ago, so anyone can feel free to reach out.
There is, as I mentioned before, JPS was the publisher of Caspe's Ethical Will. And I think the volume itself is called Ethical Wills. And there's about 6 or 8 different Rishonim that are in there with a Hebrew as well as an English translation. And I think that's a good introduction to the kind of author that he is. It doesn't have controversial material. It's mostly Musar type of information, but it's nicely written and it's good representation. Hopefully JP still has copies available if it's in print. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not either. If it is, then I'll try to put a link to the Ethical Wills. That's right. And I'll try to link to the alatorah.org. People can see the Matzah Kesef there, and like mentioned, people can email you if they want if the limited number of email me for the limited number of copies that you have available. So, so with that, thank you very much for joining me once again. And I know you worked on this, researched this, and wrote this many decades ago. So I appreciate you coming, joining me to talk about it.
Well, listen, I appreciate you bringing this to the attention of your loyal listeners. And kol hakavod to you. I think you're doing tremendous work. Keep it up.
Thank you.